31. I don't understand, Cass said, a panic growing in his chest. The creature. It's speaking using the captain's voice. Because it took his ship and his entire crew. Or absorbed them, I'm not sure, Zenfor replied. The Iphigenia is gone. There's no trace remaining, and no other life signs other than that creature. I believe it has lured us here, but for what purpose, I'm not sure. Cass opened a secure channel to the other ships and Tempest. I think we have a problem. Zenfor says the transmission is coming from the creature itself, that it is speaking with the captain's voice. That doesn't make sense, Gribbon said. We've been monitoring. He said I came here, not he. If the creature was speaking, wouldn't... I don't think semantics matter at this point, Evie broke in. We need to consider there's a hostile organism. Abort mission. Cass couldn't agree more. Whether the creature was trying to deceive them by telling them it was the captain, or if the captain's consciousness still resided inside it and had been corrupted in some way, didn't matter. Either way, this was a hostile force that had drawn Iphigenia and Genesis in on purpose. It knew what it was doing. All Space Wings, escort the shuttles back, Ravenkel announced. We have a problem over here, Gribbon said. Our engines are malfunctioning. We can't get any thrust. The electromagnetic field around the ship. It has increased tenfold, Zenfor said. The creature is attempting to pull it in. Can we get over there and evacuate them? Cass asked Box. Not without getting stuck in the field, he replied. No, you don't get to leave, Captain Morrow's voice said. Soon you'll join us. My knowledge will be filled. What the fuck is he talking about? Cass asked, frantically searching for an option. All wings, fire on that son of a bitch, Ravenkel announced. Cass watched the 5 fighters turn and unleash the full power of their weapons on the center of the creature. Any effect? He asked Zenfor. Nothing I can see. It still has hold of the other shuttle. Can they disrupt the field with their anti-grav generators? He looked from Zenfor to Box, then back again. One of them had to have an idea. They can try. Zenfor was lost for words. Helicon? Overload your anti-grav generator. It might be enough to break yourselves free, Cass said. We'll have to eject it first, Susanna said. Then you or the wings will need to tow us back. We'll be too heavy to move under our own power. There was palpable panic in her voice, but she was remaining professional. Ejecting the generator first was a good idea. It would make the affected area larger. We're set to grab you, Ravenkel said. Each of the Space Wings was equipped with grappling hooks. Cass had been on the other end of one of those once, when Evie had caught his hab pod. With the 5 wings working together, they should be able to haul the shuttle back. Ejecting generator now, Susanna said. Pearson, detonate. Aye, came Pearson's voice from further away. There was a flash on the screen as the generator exploded. It has disrupted the field in their immediate vicinity, Zenfor said. They can be towed away. Space Wings, your go for... I need you more, Morrow's voice said, harsher this time. There was a desperation to it that hadn't been present before. Cass watched as one of the tentacles that disappeared into the tear in space suddenly reached out and wrapped itself around the shuttle, dragging it back toward the creature. Open fire! All ships, open fire! He yelled. Commander, what do we do? Gribbon blurted. Anything. Fire anything you can. Detonate anything you can. Tempest? Kill that thing. On it, Evie said. Blades of energy swooshed by the shuttle, impacting the creature in the center, but it didn't let go of the shuttle. Explosive missiles shot from Tempest, following the energy blades, hitting the creature all over. Cass turned to Zenfor. She shook her head. Box, do something, Cass said, desperation in his own voice. Box jerked the controls and came alongside the shuttle, positioning the shuttle exhaust so it would blow right on the tentacle. He did a full burn, but it seemed to have no effect. This one now, the rest later, Morrow said, his voice becoming less and less human-like. We have to get them out of there, Cass said. Susanna, get your suits on and abandon ship, he yelled. We're trying, she said. There's a lot of turbulence. Box, we have to get over there to catch them. They're going to jump out of the access port, and we have to be there. We're the only ones who can carry them. Box nodded. Linkovich, Iavarone, escort the other shuttle. The rest of you keep firing on that fucker, Ravenkel screamed into the comm. Box flew the Parnatha so it was side by side with the Helicon. "Engage the force barrier," Cass said. Box did as he was told, and the access door slid open, revealing the blackness beyond, the glowing edges keeping space from sucking out all the oxygen and killing them. Cass could see the Helicon just beyond the door, and the massive black tentacle with its slick surface holding the shuttle tight, crushing it in some places. "Are you ready over there?" "Just about," Susanna said, and the door to the Helicon opened. She was in full enviro gear. "Not the meat," Morrow said. "The creature has generated a huge electromagnetic wave," Zenfor yelled. "We must pull back, otherwise we'll be stuck out here. We have to stay ahead of it." "We can't leave them out here," Cass yelled, desperate. "Jump! Just jump, now!" "Boss, the wave," Box said. "I know. They're almost here." Susanna's eyes were wide with fear, but he could tell she'd already resigned herself to jump. She pushed off from the door, passing through the force barrier into open space. Box had lined them up, so all she had to do was grab the side of the shuttle and pull herself in. After she jumped, Cass saw Griffin right behind her. Another slick black feeler shot out, as if from nowhere, and grabbed Blum. Before she even realized what was happening, she was sucked away from the edge of the door, faster than he could almost see, disappearing into the darkness with the tentacle. She screamed, but it was cut off in the middle. Cass had just enough time to meet Griffin's gaze before the shuttle itself was yanked down to the same speed and was gone. "I'm pulling us around," Box said. "We have to stay ahead of that wave." Cass could barely think. That hadn't just happened. We can't." Arms grabbed him from behind and closed the access door. "Go, robot," Zenfor said. The ship thrusted forward. "All wings back to Tempest," Raffinkel ordered, but Cass was barely paying any attention. All he could focus on was the continuous weapons fire coming from Tempest, and how, if they weren't careful, they might hit the shuttle. They had to go back. They had to go back. He struggled against Zenfor's grip, but her strength was superior, and he couldn't break free, no matter how hard he thrashed. "Box, take us back, goddammit! Take us back in there!" "Can't do that, boss. We have to stay ahead of this wave," he said. His metal head turned where Cass could only see one of his eyes. "Will we make it?" Zenfor lifted Cass over to her workstation, where her glyphs and maps filled the screen. "At your current speed, yes, but don't slow." "How can you be willing to leave them back there?" Cass yelled, still thrashing. "They're members of the crew. They're our friends." "They're dead, Caspian. There was no one left to save," she said. 32. "You bastard!" Raffinkel stormed toward Cass as Zenfor assisted him out of the shuttle. Box had landed it back in Bay 1, while the rest of the wings made their way over to Bay 2. But in that short time, Raffinkel had ejected from her ship, run across the entire bay, and bore down on Cass like a Calgarian bear. "That was one of my best pilots, and my friend," she said, ripping him away from Zenfor by the lapels. "And she's dead because of you." "I know," was all Cass could manage. It was his fault. Attempting contact with the creature had been his idea, and now 3 more crew members were dead because of him, because of his orders. At least last time, it had been because of someone else, at least directly, but there was no one else to blame this time. She slapped him across the face. Bryant and Jan grabbed her from behind and pulled her away from Cass as she fought like hell to get at him, her arms swinging. He didn't care if she beat him to a bloody pulp. It was all his fault. Griffin, Susanna. He felt an uncontrollable urge to break down right there on the deck. Metal hands grabbed him from behind, hoisting him up. "The captain wants to see everyone on the bridge," Box said. "It was the last order to come through." Box helped Cass forward until he realized how pathetic he was being and pulled away from his friend. He wasn't going to be escorted onto the bridge like some waif. He was going to walk up there under his own power and accept the responsibility for what he'd done. But the entire trip, he couldn't help but think about what he could have done differently. If he had just let Green destroy the creature to begin with, none of this would have happened. Or if Cass had insisted Tyler go instead of Susanna. Or if they just used one shuttle instead of 2. But he'd wanted to spread the risk. Deep down, He'd known it was probably futile, and he'd pushed all that aside in the name of the Coalition. The doors opened to the bridge, where Evie was shouting at Lieutenant Uma, ordering her to continue firing at the creature. On the main screen ahead, volleys of weapons spread out all over the darkened area, making impacts in the distance. But Cass couldn't tell if they were making any headway or not. Green turned when they entered and told Evie to hold. "Conference room," he said, indicating the door to the right. Cass led everyone into the room, not bothering to take a seat. Instead, he stood at the far end, running his hands through his hair and trying to figure out what to say. Evie and Captain Green came in behind everyone else, their faces grim. "Unfortunately, our weapons seem to have little to no effect," Green said once the doors closed behind him. Box had taken one of the seats, as had Raffinkel, while Ryant and Jan stood behind her. Zenfor stood off to the side, watching everyone. "And since the mission to attempt communication was a complete failure, I'm at a loss." "Captain, we did everything we could to save them," Box said. "But the creature knew what we were doing. It told us so." "I'm aware, Mr. Box. We received the same transmissions. They were unsettling, to say the least." Green drew a deep breath. "And now we've lost 3 exceptional officers." Cass caught Evie shoot him a look of pity. It was the last thing he wanted at the moment. "I'm willing to take full Cass began, before Green waved him off. "At this point, Rabot, I don't care about whose fault it was. I'm more concerned about how we're going to get out of this thing. We only have a matter of hours before we follow the Helicon into whatever pit of despair it was just yanked into." "I'm concerned with whose fault it is," Raffinkel said. "Licia was like my sister, and because this bastard thought he could talk to a space brain, I don't even have a body to cremate." She jumped up, almost scaling the table, before Ryant and Jan grabbed her again. "Do you hear me, you asshole? I have to give rights to an empty coffin. She was my friend, too. You think I didn't do everything I could to save her and the others? You act like you're the only one who gets to mourn," Cass yelled back. He'd liked Griffin. She'd been one of the only people to accept him as he was. Not to mention Susanna, whom he'd had a great amount of respect for. Even Pearson, who, even when he was a pain in the ass, had been a capable officer. "Calm down," Green snapped. Cass took a step back. He'd never heard Green raise his voice before. "No one is going to be mourning anyone unless we find a way out of this. Since it's obvious this creature, whatever it is, seems determined to kill us all, I'm willing to hear any suggestions. Nothing is off the table." "None of the weapons have had any effect?" Box asked. "The blades are barely denting the energy field, and the missiles are doing nothing to it. It's like firing into a vacuum. We need something more sophisticated," Evie replied. "We've been sending down continuous fire ever since it grabbed the shuttle." "What about a trans-dimensional weapon?" Zenfor asked, rubbing her chin. "I have detailed scans of the creature. A trans-dimensional weapon might have an effect, especially if it occupies more than one dimension, though it would need to be sophisticated." "You're talking about destroying space itself," Green said, his eyebrows forming a V. "Yes. This part of space would be untravelable. It would cut off a large part of the nebula from the undercurrents," Zenfor said matter-of-factly. "No, that's not an option. The Coalition outlawed those a millennium ago, and every other civilization we've come up against has agreed. They are too dangerous, even for war." "Mine didn't." "You just said nothing is off the table," Zenfor replied. "This is a viable solution." Green shook his head. "No. I will not destroy an entire sector of space for our survival. We'll send out a probe with our collected findings if we can't find another solution. The Coalition will be able to collect it and learn from our mistake. They'll also have to send another ship out to meet the Andromeda threat." Zenfor narrowed her eyes. "You don't deserve saving. When the Andromeda swarm comes, they will decimate the Coalition and all its inhabitants." Green slammed his fists on the table. Our lives are not so important we destroy all future inhabitants' ability to traverse this part of space. A transdimensional weapon will make this entire area uninhabitable for tens of thousands of years. The answer is no, Council. Zenfor huffed and stormed out of the room. After a moment, Green indicated Cass go after her, while Evie gave him a concerned look. "Keep her in line, Commander. I don't want her doing anything reckless," Green said, as Cass trotted out the door back on the bridge, not looking back as he left. There was that phrase again. Keep her in line. He needed something else to focus on at the moment, and he didn't want to see Ravenkel's accusing face again. It was bad enough already without her reminders. The hypervator doors closed behind Zenfor just as he reached them, and he had to run to the secondary hypervator on the other side of the bridge. "I'm sorry about Commander Blum," Zal said, as Cass stood, waiting for the carriage to come. "You must feel like it is your fault." Cass tried to shake it off, finding little luck. "Yeah, I do." He grimaced, trying to forget the image of Susanna being pulled down into the darkness, her screams coming through the open comm line. "It wasn't meant as an accusation. I only wish to express my condolences." "No, it's fine." "Condolences for what?" "She confided in me her admiration for you." By Cor. Cass didn't need to know that. Was that what she'd been getting at? Why she'd wanted to be on a first-name basis? Now all he wanted to do was hitch at the hips and throw up all over the floor. But he had a job to do. He couldn't let Zenfor out of his sight for long. He'd have to process that later. "Do me a favor and track the Council, see where she's going." "Internal scans indicate Deck 12. Cass racked his brain. What was on 12? Not her quarters or the weapons lab. What was she doing? "I believe she might be headed toward the bar." What? That didn't make any sense. The Sill didn't drink alcohol. She told him so herself. The hypervator doors opened, and Cass stepped in. "Tell Green I'll bring her back, but I don't want to spook her." "I'll let him know. Try not to fret. You couldn't have known the creature was hostile." Saul needed to work on his tact. Empathy was not one of his strong suits. And the fact was, Cass had already suspected the creature was dangerous, and he tried to go against his gut and do things the right way. Look where that had led him. He shook it off as the doors closed, and he hit the indicator for 12. He needed to get his head straight. He needed to bring Zenfor back, or at least keep her from doing any damage. But what damage could she do in the bar, other than smash some bottles of whiskey? Whatever she was doing, he was determined to find out. 33. So this was the place. Zenfor took in the space, its dark paneled woods and warm lighting creating what the humans called a cozy atmosphere. But she didn't see the appeal. This wasn't cozy to her. It was like everything else on this ship, cold, detached, and sterile. Everything here was so disconnected. It was a miracle these people even managed to function. How could one be expected to serve on a ship and not be in harmony with it, not be aligned with everyone else on that ship? The people here, each one had their own set of beliefs and values, and hardly any of them were compatible. And those who were often clashed, such as Caspian Rabot and Evelyn Diazol. She hadn't experienced so much discord since before leaving Fazlea. Life in space was supposed to be harmonious, not contentious. It was clear to her she only had a few more hours to live, and she had to spend those final hours in a place disconnected from those she knew and loved. It was not the ending she'd wish on any Sill. Zenfor shoved the door to the bar open, forcing herself inside. The lights remained dimmed, but it was enough she could still see. She made her way over to the bar itself and grabbed the first bottle she saw. It had been difficult getting used to ingesting again after so many years of not even thinking about it. Renglass had taken care of all her bodily functions, as it did for every member of the crew. So much she'd nearly forgotten about them. but disconnecting from the ship had brought all those familiar sensations screaming back to her, and it took some time to learn how to regulate her systems. The Coalition machines managed to synthesize food she and Molest could eat without making them sick, which was all they needed. But even the simplest things, like keeping her body clean, had become a chore. She'd forgotten how much time was wasted on maintenance, and had she not fallen into a regular schedule, would have disregarded it. She had Molest to thank for that. By the fates of Guy, she missed her. Saying goodbye to her ship and crewmates had been hard enough, but saying goodbye to Molest had almost killed her. She truly thought she might die from the pain. But somehow she'd survived, trundled on, and managed not to kill anyone on the ship yet. They had known their days were limited on their short trip to the Coalition station, and though she'd tried to stay present and keep every moment in her heart, she couldn't help but become apprehensive at the thought of separating. In the end, it had been worse than she could have even imagined. She took a chair on the far side of the room, ripped the stopper from the bottle, and emptied it into her mouth. Not caring, some mist and dribbled down her chin at the sides of her cheeks. It was an interesting taste, like that of earth mixed with fire, and it burned her throat as it traveled down. But she didn't stop until the bottle was empty. She set it aside and leaned back in the chair, waiting for the so-called effects. Next time, you might want to take it slower. She didn't bother turning to face him. It was obvious he'd come after her. After all, she couldn't be allowed to be on her own for very long, could she? Caspian took the seat beside her. I'd like to sip it, relish the taste. At least that's what I tell myself, so I don't think of myself as an alcoholic. Your entire society is going to perish because you can't see past your own rules, she said, pushing the confrontation in the conference room out of her mind. These people were so enamored with the society they had built, they thought it was immune to distortion. He took the bottle, examining it. I don't know what's right anymore. Once upon a time I thought I did. And then everything changed, and I had to adapt to something new. I had to live with the new truth, that in its heart the Coalition was corrupt. But then I came back, and so many things have changed, while so many others have stayed the same. I thought I could return and make things better. But that's not possible, is it? She eyed him, still feeling nothing from the alcohol. It's a complex situation. You can't run an empire with trillions of beings and remain virtuous. There are too many variables. Is that how you see us? As an empire? He glanced up. It doesn't matter. If this Andromeda is as deadly as they seem, your society will be wiped out within a few short years. It won't take long. Your people have forgotten life is pain and sacrifice. It is a struggle to survive. Without the struggle, without the fight, something larger and stronger will always come to replace you. I've read your history. You know about natural selection. Caspian nodded. Why haven't your people ever bothered us? Even after we attacked you a century ago. It wasn't worth the time or the effort. He chuckled. Good to know. All of this, he gestured to the room, and she assumed the rest of the ship, doesn't matter to you, does it? What matters to me is my people and my connections to them. In the end, that is all that matters. He pressed the bottle to his forehead. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why I thought I could communicate with that creature. I just wanted to believe that it wasn't malicious, that it wasn't out to get us, that not everything out there was bad. He sighed. At least he recognized he had been deluding himself, as she'd said. If only he'd had that insight a few days ago. I guess I thought I could make it understand, that I could reach it on some fundamental level. That was arrogance and pride, she said. And fear. Some things you can't change, no matter how hard you try, she said, feeling more open and willing to speak than she had in some time. Was that the alcohol? Or had she become comfortable with this human? He had been the one she'd spent the most time with. But that meant little. It was quality of time that mattered, not quantity. But she hadn't felt anything like this since leaving Molesse. Perhaps she needed an outlet. "You asked about my singing." Cass said nothing else. His eyes remained locked on hers, and for the first time she felt vulnerable. She wasn't sure if she liked it with someone other than a sill, but she'd already opened the door. "When I was a youth, I was sent to a training facility with others of my kind. But it is not like your academy. We are sent there, away from our primary families, to learn the skills we will need for our purpose. I told you my purpose was to be a consul, along with thousands of others still. And thus, I was sent to the consul training camp to receive all the instruction I would need for my life commanding a SIL ship. Being away from my primary family was difficult at first, though I made new attachments. Part of the need to leave is to show us a family outside of our own, others we can connect with. And while many of us are the same age, not all are. Because as SIL, if we do not complete our training, we cannot go out into our society to perform our functions. As a consequence, there were SIL in the training camp who had been there far longer than others. Some had even been there for decades, according to your time measurements. He tilted toward her. "You mean they couldn't leave? Until they finished the training?" Sanford shook her head. "It is a requirement. There was an older woman who stayed in the unit next to mine. She had been there the longest, and every night she would sing. Each night it would filter through the walls and the windows." She closed her eyes. "She had the most beautiful voice, and I would look forward to it every night before I slept. The woman, whose name was Zakria, had been in the camp for 2 SIL generations. She was born to be a consul, but had never made it all the way through. Not that it bothered her. She stayed in the camp, helping some of the others with their rudimentary skills. She had committed to those easily, but she could never seem to pass the final test." "She was a teacher," Caspian said, still watching her. "I suppose she was. One night, as I prepared to sleep, expecting to hear her voice lull me to sleep, I instead heard silence. I called for her, but found no response. Upon checking her room, I realized it had been vacated sometime during the day, and I realized what had happened." Her eyes snapped open on the unpleasant memory. "She graduated?" Caspian offered. "She was recycled." At his look of horror, she continued, "You see, the SIL will tolerate weakness, but only to a certain point. And after that, they will do what is necessary to move forward. Zakria wasn't ever going to graduate. She knew it, and the commander of the training camp knew it. But instead of sending her back to her family in disgrace, he kept her there, to help others until she reached the limit. Because as SIL, we each have a certain amount of time to reach our potential. If we don't, we are killed, and our bodies are recycled. Notices are sent to our families. Zakria's family received a notice that day." "Fuck," Caspian whispered, releasing the bottle. "They just kill you?" She shrugged, feeling a twinge of disgust with herself as she did. Zakria's death was nothing to be brushed off, no matter what the SIL said. She had fulfilled as much of a purpose as she could. "But she was a teacher," he argued. "She could have continued to teach new students coming in. Wasn't there value in that? She was not born to be a teacher. She was born to be a consul. I told you, we have designated roles, and we do not deviate from them. There are no exceptions." Sanford spread her hands out, recalling how she would sit and meditate, listening to Zakria's voice. "But you never forgot her." I sing in her honor. My voice could never match hers, but I still do it to remind me of her. To remind me everything ends and life is fleeting." She took a deep breath, her emotions rising closer to the surface than they had in weeks. "I'm sorry for your friend," Caspian finally said after a prolonged silence. "I don't think she deserved that. She taught me some of the greatest lessons of my life. I worked hard to never end up like her. I didn't want to be recycled one day. But she also showed me that sometimes you can't change people, no matter how hard you try. Zakria was never going to be a consul. No amount of time in a training camp would ever change that. She was a singer and a teacher, and she died being those things, against everything my society told me was true." She turned back to Caspian. "Sometimes we are who we are, not who everyone else expects us to be. And you can't change someone's true nature." His eyes softened, and his breath hitched. Caspian stared down at his uniform, as if he was seeing it for the first time. "You're right. The Coalition is going to hang itself with its own rope, unless we do something to stop it." She watched him for a moment. It was clear from the intense stare the wheels in his mind were turning. She may have finally gotten through to him. "We'll have to move fast. Are you with me?" She nodded, standing. Perhaps not all of them were doomed. 34. "We need to get back down to the weapons lab. How long will it take to build a transdimensional weapon?" Cass asked, powering forward. They'd left the bar behind, and despite having consumed an entire bottle of firebrand, Zenfor seemed unaffected, though she had opened up more than he thought possible. Maybe instead of inebriating them, alcohol lowered a Sill's inhibitions enough to get them to drop their guard. "I can do it quickly, if I have access to one of the ship's missiles," Zenfor said. "My people have been developing transdimensional weaponry for a long time. The creatures that live in interdimensional space can be dangerous." "And you've used the weapons against them?" "That would mean areas of Sill space had to be impassable." "Only when necessary, such as in instances like this." They were making their way through the ship as quickly as they could. The corridor they were in now was long and wide, enough room so at least 5 people could walk side by side and still have enough room. "I still don't understand your captain. He knows this ship is the only one who can gather intelligence about the Andromeda threat, and yet he's willing to sacrifice the ship because of a Coalition statute?" "He's doing what he thinks best for the good of the Coalition. There's no point in defending yourself against a threat if there's nothing to defend. Green wouldn't commit treason by using a transdimensional weapon. He'd be court-martialed for it. Evie, too, for allowing it to happen. It wouldn't matter if the entire Coalition was about to fall apart. They'd still throw them in jail. But Zenfor was right. It needed to be done. And if this part of space was no longer usable for a few thousand years, then so be it. But at least it gave them a chance of survival. "Your people need a serious lesson in priorities," she said. He almost laughed. At least the Coalition didn't kill their own people when they failed out of the academy. And they weren't subjected to one line of work for their entire lives. She couldn't think that was right. Not after what she'd witnessed. Or could she? Maybe humans and the Sill weren't as similar as he'd once thought. Cass tapped the back of his hand, activating his comm. "Box? Here, boss." "Are you still in the conference room?" he asked. "No. The captain sent me back down to sickbay. They want to try a biological weapon from one of Zax's stores." Cass exchanged glances with Zenfor. A biological weapon wouldn't have any effect on this thing. If they couldn't even penetrate it with blades and missiles, what were they going to do? Inject it with a needle? It would have to have a porous surface to absorb the poison. "Is anyone asking about us? Have they missed us up there?" "I don't think so. Everyone's distracted with fighting off the creature, trying other plans. But the captain also sent down orders for engineering to prepare a data probe containing all the available data on Tempest. to send out in case we don't make it. Cass groaned. Okay, if they ask you about where either myself or Zenfor are, stall them and tell them you don't know. I'm switching off my comm. Boss? What are you doing? There was never much variation in the tone of Box's voice when he wasn't doing one of his stupid accents, but Cass heard some in there now. Nothing. Plausible deniability. Just keep the captain off our asses. I'll do what I can. Mr. Box out. Cass tapped his comm twice more to disable it. He's the most trustworthy one of you all, Zenfor said as they picked up speed back to engineering. They wouldn't have much time. He's good like that, when he's not being a complete ass. They had been lucky Box flew the shuttle. Without his expertise, they may not have been able to make it back before that large electromagnetic wave hit. Cass hadn't registered it at the time, as he'd been pummeled by the loss of Susanna and Griffin. But if they hadn't made it back, there was a good chance the creature would have already pulled them in as well. Without Tempest's powerful engines, anything else was bound to be sucked in. He turned to Zenfor. Are your probes still out there? I don't know. The last I saw, they were close to the tear in space, the opening which I believe allowed the creature to come into this universe. Why? Because I want to make sure we seal that tear. Even if this part of space is no longer usable, I don't want that thing coming back and luring in another ship. Cass gritted his teeth. He grappled with the fact the creature had used Captain Marl's own voice to entice them. It was an impressive level of sophisticated trickery, and it would require a sharp mind. He wished they could get to know more about the creature without killing it. It would be fascinating. If I can still retrieve the telemetry, I'll alter the signature of the missile to seal the tear. It's something we contend with sometimes, living on multiple planes. Occasionally, our ships will accidentally disrupt the barrier between worlds, especially when they're strained. The repair takes some time and doesn't grow back as strong as before the tear. She picked up the pace. Wait, what do you mean? What grows back? He asked. The fabric of the universe. What else? When they were close to engineering, Cass stopped them in the corridor. We'll need access to the current cache of missiles, which means we'll need Sester's approval before moving one to work on it. Which also means he'll be required to report it to the bridge. Without... His breath hitched again, and he had to suppress the feelings. Without Susanna up there, I don't know if they've got anyone monitoring or not. But we can't take any chances. While they're distracted with this biological weapon, we need to move quickly and quietly to get this done. When we get in there, let me talk to Sester. He's been amenable to me before, and he might be willing to help us. What about coalition regulations? Zenfor asked. Claxians are pacifists by nature. I don't know how he'll feel about it. If he decides he needs to notify the captain, though, I don't think there's much we can do. We'll just have to hope he's on our side. She narrowed her eyes. I wouldn't count on anyone being on our side. You said yourself we are committing an act of treason by building and using this weapon. We can't count on anyone. She was right. Still, they need Sester's approval to move one of the missiles into the weapons lab. So far, they hadn't needed access to any physical weapons yet. Everything Zenfor had been working on was purely theoretical. The test would come later. Cass could always lie to Sester, say they needed it for another reason. But he'd probably be able to tell. That was the problem with being psychic. We'll have to do our best, Cass said. He led the way into engineering, which was a flurry of activity. Sester was in the back, in his cradle, operating 3 different systems at once, while the rest of the crew were at their emergency stations. Hello, Commander. We're engaged in a crisis here, trying to keep the ship from being pulled into the vortex. So I noticed, Cass said. When he spoke, Ensign Tyler glanced up. His eyes went wide, and he stepped around the console, though Cass couldn't quite tell what was going on behind his eyes. Commander? Is everything all right? He asked. Is there something you need? Sester, we're here because we have to save the ship, and we need your help to do it. Cass hoped Sester could still receive his thoughts. His focus wasn't what it normally was. You want a missile to modify. It will violate regulations, the Claxian replied. I know, But it's the only way to save the ship. The biological weapon won't work. Commander? Tyler asked. Cass winced. He couldn't trust Tyler to help him. The man neither liked nor respected him. We came to see if we could help, Zenfor said. Tyler turned to her. It is against everything the Coalition stands for. As a Coalition officer, you can't authorize the use of such a destructive weapon, not without authorization from Coalition Central. Cass focused his thoughts. I know. Good thing I'm no longer a Coalition officer. You've resigned again? Not formally, Cass thought. I know I can't authorize the use of that missile, but I can ask you, as someone who wants to see the Coalition survive into the future, what is the best alternative? We're the Coalition's only chance to face Andromeda. If we don't make it out there, it could have disastrous consequences that last far longer than the use of a transdimensional weapon. You want to help? Tyler said, derision in his voice. Thank you, but we don't need any help. We've got it. Zenfor shrugged. Very well, Caspian Rabot. I will assist. But I will also be required to reveal my part in this endeavor, and I will face the consequences accordingly. Thank you. Please send it over to the weapons lab. We don't have a lot of time. Cass focused on Tyler. We thought, with the loss of Pearson... Tyler shook his head. No, but thank you. We have it covered. Cass nodded. Sester was still operating all three systems at once, his limbs moving in concert with each other. He turned to Zenfor and led the way back to the main door that rolled away. Commander? Tyler called out, causing Cass to stop. I wanted to say I'm grateful you agreed with Commander Diazol's change to the shuttle roster. I would have been... Cass pushed away thoughts of punching the kid right in the mouth. He had a right to be grateful. One person's decision had kept him from certain death. Yeah, don't mention it. Cass turned his back on Tyler once again. They exited engineering and headed for the adjacent weapons lab, a few doors down. That pompous little ass, Cass said, as soon as they were out of earshot. It should have been him on that ship, not Susanna. It seemed you and Commander Bloom were entering the initial stages of a friendship. Possibly more, Zenfor said. Yeah, and I didn't realize until it was too late. I don't guess the Sill have mastered time travel, have they? Zenfor arched an eyebrow. Not to my knowledge. But it's interesting. You'd use time travel to go back and experience a relationship you have missed, but you never asked me that question about a way to save the ship. I was kidding, obviously, Cass replied, all humor gone from his voice. Still, I find it curious. But then again, you are a society of contradictions. The door to the weapons lab slid open, and they stepped inside. The missile was being delivered by 2 small hover drones that had come from the other direction. Well, he's good to his word, Cass said. Shall we get started? 35. Work on the missile proceeded quickly. Zenfor had managed to locate the probes. They were still transmitting from deep within the tear in space, though the information coming from them was plagued with interference. Cass kept his eyes on Tempest's internal sensors, making sure no one was checking on them. He was confident Box could keep them occupied in the event they did start to question his and Zenfor's disappearance. But on the other hand, Green might just think Cass was helping her cool off. Though he did find it interesting they weren't being consulted for any other possible solutions to the problem. Maybe Green had had enough of Cass's input. Maybe he no longer saw any value in his suggestions after the fuck-up with the shuttles. Whatever the reason, Cass hoped they could hold out until the work was done, because then things would get really complicated. You realize that by building this weapon for you, I am breaking my own rule, correct? Zenfor asked, as she was hunched over the weapon. What? Cass asked. He hadn't been paying attention. Had she been talking to him this entire time? This weapon uses Sill technology, something I expressly forbade myself to offer you. But the situation has changed, and I now see I can't survive without giving you this. I want you to understand the significance. You're preaching to the choir, he said, still absently watching the internal sensors. What does that mean? He glanced over his monitor. Oh, it's an old colloquialism. It means you're telling me something I already know. Yes, Well, you knew it before and decided to ignore it. I know. Cass returned his attention to the sensors. Humans have the unique ability to ignore things, even when they're right in front of their faces. If it doesn't fit with what we're expecting, we have a bad habit of disregarding it and moving on. It's an inefficient use of life, she said. I'm not sure I'd go that far. Surely your people were the same at some point in your distant past. Zenfor scoffed. My people have been through turbulent times as well, but nothing like what is in your history, or even your prehistory. Let me guess. You walked out of the oceans on Thisleia completely in harmony with everything around you. Not... She turned, her attention drawn by something off to her side. What is that? What? He asked, leaving the internal sensors. She examined one of the screens containing information from the probes. The probes are picking something up. Something inside the tear itself. Another audio transmission. She leaned in closer to adjust the gains. It had to be the creature again. Hadn't they already confirmed no one was left alive in there? Or was it possible? Did he dare to hope? Tempest? Are you out there? A female voice said. Cass's heart leapt into his throat. It was Susanna. He sprung forward, all his attention on the screen. Is that? He found he couldn't catch his breath. They needed to get to another shuttle. They had to find a way in there to get her. Are you out there? Help us. This time it was Griffin. Somehow they'd survived. We have to notify the captain. Cass jumped up, but Zenfor grabbed him by the arm. What are you doing? We can't destroy it while they're still in there. No, Zenfor said. Look. She pointed to one of the wavelength patterns of the voices coming through. That's not Commander Blum or Captain Griffin. This pattern matches the same one we recorded when Captain Morrow spoke to us. It is using their voices. No, they were still in there. They were still alive, and Cass would find a way to reach them. I'll get Box, he yelled, headed for the door. Don't fire until we get back. Caspian! He stopped just before reaching the door. Zenfor was right. As much as he didn't want her to be, he knew she was. It was nothing but another ruse. Cass balled his hands into fists and used all his willpower to stop from hitting the nearest solid object. This creature, this thing, whatever it was insidious. And he realized, as fascinating or unique as it might be, he hated it, and he wanted nothing more than to destroy it for good. I've never encountered anything like this, Zenfor said. The types of beings that inhabited the space beneath were confined to one dimension, not split between them like this. It's almost as if this creature clawed its way out of its own dimension into this one. Cass returned to her. But no one has ever logged it before. There was never any mention of it in any of the search logs for Iphigenia, and they scoured this area. She leaned in. Perhaps it only comes through every 27 of your years to lure a ship in, then disappears again. Cass was trying to clear his head, but it was clouded of thoughts of Susanna falling into that darkness. You think the creature will return to its realm once it has Tempest? I assume so. It would explain why no other ships have been trapped or even found this area. So what? It takes a ship, then uses that ship's crew to call for help? To lure in its next meal? It may be more sophisticated than that. We know this creature has a high level of intelligence. It obviously originated in the other universe, through that tear. Its food source is probably there as well. I think it lures these ships in for another reason. What on earth could it want or need from us? Cass asked, exasperated. Information. This may be how this creature learns about the universe around it. It doesn't destroy the ships. We know that much because we found no debris. But what if it absorbs them in some way? Cass's eyes went wide. He turned to the display that showed the physical form of the creature, focusing on the hardened mountainous regions they'd seen at the initial scans. A quick spectral analysis revealed they were composed of galvanium, cyclax, and an abundance of proteins and carbon. They're there. They're part of the creature. Zenfor turned her attention to the screen. Are you thinking that is what happened to them? They were transformed in some way? Maybe. I'm not sure. But those are coalition metals. And I would bet the concentration of carbon and proteins is what is left of the people it killed in pursuit of information. They are part of it now. And maybe that's how it's able to absorb their voices. An interesting hypothesis, she said. I wish we had time to test it. I don't want to test it. I want to kill that thing. Then kill it again for good measure, Cass said, narrowing his eyes. Is the missile almost done? She returned her attention to the project. Close. Only a few more minutes. And you're right. Attempting to study the creature would only lead to more deaths. Obviously, it can't be reasoned with. No, it couldn't. And they were about to use illegal technology to make sure it never trapped anyone else ever again. Cass couldn't believe he was back in this position, willingly disobeying a direct order because he thought it was the right thing to do. Why was it every time he disagreed with an order, he took it upon himself to break the rules as he saw fit? Who came along and anointed him the ultimate authority on morality? But deep down, he knew he wasn't wrong. This was the correct course of action, even if it did go against Coalition standards. It was a completely different problem from Rutledge. In that case, he made a moral call to defend what he thought were the Coalition's most cherished values. And for some officers, such as Captain Green, they probably were. But Green was on the opposite end of the spectrum, ready to sacrifice everything for those values, rather than see the bigger picture. Cass shuddered. For a short moment, he realized what Rutledge must have felt like on the bridge of the Atlas, watching his first officer disobey his orders and put the very future of the Coalition at risk. It wasn't an association he relished. I believe it's ready, Zenfor said. As long as it detonates close to the creature, it should obliterate it and seal the tear at the same time. But the ship will need to move away immediately upon detonation. Tempest's engines are fast enough, we should be able to outrun the shockwave that will decimate this part of space. Assuming the electromagnetic field will be disrupted the moment the creature is killed. I'll let Box know. Cass tapped his comm again to turn it back on. He can take the controls in an emergency if necessary. I was impressed by his piloting skills, she said, shutting the various hatches and ports on the missile itself. He's been that way ever since I met him. Always good with the ship. Zenfor picked up the missile, hoisting it under her arm. Cass didn't even want to guess how much it weighed, though he doubted he could manage it, even with 2 arms. We need to get this to missile launch control, she said. Deck 15, Cass replied. It's mostly automated, but there are a few technicians down there who make sure everything runs smoothly. Then perhaps your commission will be needed once again, she smirked. He almost laughed in response. It was so rare to see her smile. He tapped his comm again. Box? Here. Status? I'm on my way back to the bridge. Zax just sent one of her biological samples down to weapon control. They're about to load it into a missile to fire. Cass turned to Zenfor. We need to hurry. If we can get them to replace that missile with this one, Green and everyone else on the bridge won't know it's not the biological weapon. They won't try to shoot it down before it reaches the creature. You better hurry, boss. I think Commander Diazol might be getting suspicious, Box said. Cass opened the door back into the corridor, checking both directions. It was empty. Why do you say that? Call it aluminum intuition, he replied. Whatever you're doing, hurry. Thanks. Cass switched off the comm again. Can you run with that thing? Zenfor nodded. He could only hope they wouldn't cross paths with anyone, at least not anyone of consequence on the way there. But the crew should be at their battle stations. No one should be aimlessly wandering the corridors. Regardless, they didn't have a choice. Let's get this done, he said, breaking into a trot down the hall, with Zenfor right behind him. 36. Evie surveyed the bridge. Everyone was worried. It was evident on their faces. But no one had cracked, and they'd all remained professional, even in the face of what was almost guaranteed to be certain death. The biological weapon idea had come from Lieutenant Uma, though Evie didn't expect it to have much of a chance of working. If the creature was smart enough to lure them in like this, it was smart enough to defend itself against anything that might infect it. She still couldn't believe such a creature existed. And for nothing other than bad timing, they were going to die here, trying to keep it from taking any other ships. Such was the life of a Coalition officer. But it wasn't the life she wanted. She'd wanted to complete the mission, to find out what Andromeda really was. And she wanted to see her father one more time. Even if he didn't know who she was, he was the only family she had left. But it seemed like the universe had dealt her hand, and closing up old wounds wasn't in the cards. She also hated going out like this, guns blazing, and for no reason. She'd wanted her death to have meaning, to make a difference somewhere. She supposed if the Coalition ever found their data probe, they'd know, and Tempest's sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. But no one would remember Commander Evie Diazol. She'd be another name in a list of 171 souls who were lost on this day. And then she'd fade into obscurity. No one to mourn her, no one to remember her. Evie glanced over as Box re-entered the bridge. "Report, Mr. Box," Green said, not taking his eyes off the screen ahead of them. They'd ceased all weapons fire for the moment, but the engines were still being strained to their capacity. Their last hope was this missile, though by seeing the resignation on Green's face, Evie could tell he didn't think it would work either. "Dr. Zaks is transferring the materials now, sir. It should be ready in a few minutes. They told me they'd send you a comm when it was ready to fire." "Very good. All hands, maintain your positions. We're not going down without a fight." Evie watched Green from the corner of her eye. He was capable, dedicated, and above all else, a man of high integrity. Zenfor had suggested a way out of this, the way they could all survive, and Evie couldn't say it in the conference room, but on some level, she agreed with her. Even though it was against one of the most basic Coalition tenets, shouldn't they use a way out if they had it? Coalition ships didn't carry transdimensional weapons. The only ones the Coalition had any access to were in a stronghold orbiting Osiris, and there weren't that many. But Zenfor had made it sound as if she could make one herself. Didn't they have a responsibility to try, despite the consequences? After all her years in the Coalition, Evie thought she might be seeing what Cass had been talking about. Speaking of which, where was he? She caught Box's optic and motioned for him to follow her to the other side of the bridge. He glanced at Ron to the pilot's seat, who was trying to keep the ship together and away from that thing as long as possible. But he'd been fighting the controls for some time now. "Can I help you, Commander?" Box asked in an uncharacteristically sweet voice. "Where's Caspian? And Zenfor? I haven't heard back from him regarding her." It had only been 40 minutes since she had stormed out of the conference room, and he'd chased after her. But it couldn't have taken him that long to find and catch up, could it? She knew he wouldn't fathom putting her in the brig, but she'd at least thought she would have heard something by now. "They went to, the bar, I believe. The extenuating circumstances of their impending dooms convinced them to share a drink together before we all perish in a nightmare scenario none of us can truly fathom." His yellow eyes blinked rapidly. Cass told her the pattern of blinking often betrayed Box's emotions, though she had no clue what they were telling her now. And she wouldn't be surprised if Cass took Zenfor down to the bar. Cor knew he spent enough time there himself. "Do you know why his comm isn't working? I've tried a few times to reach him." "I wouldn't know, Commander. I just happened to pass them on my way to sickbay." "But sickbay is on 14. The bar is on 12. How did you pass them?" Box straightened. "I, accidentally went to 12 by mistake, then took a different hypervator back up. There. That's plausible." Evie's eyes narrowed. "I mean, that's what happened." "Box?" "It's Mr. Box now." He straightened a bit more. "Box, tell me the truth. Where is he? What's going on?" "Damn it," he whispered. "I didn't have enough time to think of a cover story. You didn't give me enough time." "What's he doing? Tell me now." His eyes blinked a few more times. "I wish I could, Commander. But I don't know. He wouldn't tell me his plans. He only told me to distract you and the captain if you came asking about him, which I probably shouldn't have said." He rocked back and forth on his metal feet. "I guess it's going to be a few lashings for old Box," he said, in an accent Evie had never heard before. Did he say where he was going? Or anything about? Of course. It was obvious. He and Zenfor were going to use the transdimensional weapon. What else would he need to cover up? "Commander, is something wrong? Other than the fact we're all about to be killed horribly?" Box asked. She glanced at the captain, who wasn't paying them any attention. His focus was on his own work, and maintaining the morale of the bridge crew so everyone didn't fall apart when it mattered. Her first inclination was to tell him. In fact, it was her duty. He would be able to put a stop to it. She was bound by coalition regulations to inform a superior officer of any breach of security or possible subterfuge on her ship. And yet, she hesitated. Evie shouldn't be doing this. She should tell the captain immediately. What was wrong with her? Not only was she violating the oath she'd taken when she graduated from the academy, she was violating the personal promise she'd made to herself to never put her own self-interest above those of others. The Coalition banned transdimensional weapons for a reason. It wasn't up to her to decide whether they should be used or not. So why was she just standing there? Commander, you look like you are in distress. Do you need to go to sick bay? Box asked. Huh? She'd forgotten he was even there. No, I'm fine, she finally said. I just need to talk to the captain about something. You sound unsure, he replied. Are you conflicted? No, she said. No, I'm not. 37. They'd made good progress so far, having traveled the corridors without running into anyone yet. He'd seen crewman Tess walking ahead of them, but she'd gone in a different direction, leaving the rest of the large corridor free. And somehow, Zenfor wasn't showing any signs of fatigue yet, despite the huge missile under her arm, though she had switched it to the other side. If you drop that thing, it won't go off, right? Cass asked. I won't drop it. But I mean, if you did, would it go off? I won't. Great. That made him feel loads better. Potential annihilation following him at less than a meter. It was strange being so close to death. Not that it was something he feared. In fact, he'd never feared death. He'd always been much more afraid of an unfulfilled life. Those years in prison had been some of the hardest because it was as if the clock was just ticking away and he had too much to accomplish. It was the same now. Dying at the hands of this creature didn't scare him. The thought of leaving so much unfinished did. Here, last adjacent corridor. It's down here, he said. What will happen to you when they realize what we've done? Zenfor asked. I'll probably be thrown back in jail, Cass said. Also, they'll try to give me a dishonorable discharge like last time. But I won't allow that, because I've already resigned. Green just hasn't received my letter yet. You'll go to prison for the rest of your life? She asked. He shook his head. I don't know. Because of the nature of this mission, I'm not sure how Coalition Central would react to knowing what we're doing here. They might decide you being on the ship is too big of a risk and transport you back to 8, where you can return home. If that's the case, I'll most likely be dropped off at the nearest starbase before Tempest leaves Coalition territory. He chuckled as he turned the corner. Though, if it's anything like last time, my shuttle might explode before I even get there. Save everyone the trouble. Wait, I don't understand. They tried to harm you in prison? Not exactly. They sent me to a penal colony where I was to serve out a term of manual labor until my release. But it wasn't exactly a human-friendly place, if you know what I mean. I'm afraid I don't. Let's just say, if I hadn't found a way out, I wouldn't be here right now. That's a logical line of thought. Had I not left my ship, I wouldn't be here right now either. Or if I'd never graduated from the training camp, or if I'd never been born. She shifted the missile under her arm, and Cass's heart rate skyrocketed. No, not like that, he said, taking a breath. Never mind. It's right here. He approached the door to weapons control, tapping his credentials, which gave them access. Inside was a wide room. In the center were 2 missile tubes, which were fed by the large store of weapons stored in protective containers to the left and right. The system could be set up to fire up to 3 at a time from each tube, or they could be loaded manually if the power or targeting systems went offline. 3 people looked up as they entered. 2 were weapons technicians, Crewman Barstow and Ensign Talia, in addition to Dr. Zax, who was at the moment bent over one of the missiles ready for loading in the tubes. Commander, Zax said, is there a problem? He hadn't expected Zax to be here. It was a hiccup, but not a major obstacle. No problem. But we've been ordered to use this missile instead, he said, pointing to the one in Zenfor's arms. It's already been modified. Zack straightened. I didn't modify it. Who else has access to the ship's biological cultures and diseases? It's part of the project Zenfor has been working on to confront the alien swarm. Cass was almost startled at how easily the line came back to him. It was as if nothing had changed at all. Zack's aquamarine eyes sparkled, and Cass couldn't tell if she believed him or not. He wasn't exactly up on his Yaks-Inax body language. Set it over there, Zack said. I want to check it over before we launch. That's not necessary, Doctor, Cass said. The Council has studied. No matter how much information she's absorbed, she does not have the experience to match, Zack said sharply. I will not be sending a missile out there until I am absolutely sure it is safe for this crew. Doctor, That's the end of it, Commander. No more arguments. Either set the missile over there or leave. Cass noticed the two weapons techs exchanged glances. As soon as Zax opened the casing on the missile, she'd know what was going on. He had no doubt about it. But what choice did they have? They couldn't incapacitate all three of them at once. Cass wasn't even sure how to incapacitate a Yaks-Inax. Having two sets of arms came in pretty handy when attempting to break through restraints. He was reminded of the immobilization field on Zenfor's ship that had held him in place. They could really use one of those right now. Cass motioned for Zenfor to set the missile down, which he did while remaining silent, but with her eyes on Cass. Zack seemed to relax once the missile was in place and turned back to the one she was working on, closing up its hatches. Ensign, please return this unit to storage. We won't need it. Yes, Doctor, Ensign Talia replied. She had short brown hair, shaved on one side, with a tattoo of something on her skull, but she moved too quick for Cass to catch it. A drone moved over and retrieved the missile, taking it back into the storage area. Let's see how well you did, Zack said, her voice more upbeat than before. Cass assessed his options. If Zenfor could restrain Zax, as much as he didn't want her to, he might be able to grab the ensign and crewman before they could alert the bridge. But their stations were on opposite sides of the room, and honestly, he'd be lucky to reach one of them in time. Forget about both. But if he could reach the controls... Zack stood over the missile, opening its panels with a touch and peering inside. She stared for a beat before turning back to him. Is there something you want to tell me, Commander? Cass was about to tell Zenfor to grab Talia while he went for Barstow, but the doors to the weapons lab opened behind them to reveal Evie. She had a stern look on her face, and it didn't slip Cass's notice she'd armed herself, but the weapon remained attached to her hip. Oh, shit, he said under his breath. Ensign Talia? Crewman Barstow? Please wait outside these doors. Make sure we aren't disturbed, she said. The two techs nodded and left the room, the doors closing behind them. Evie turned her attention to the doctor. Doctor? Where did that missile come from? Commander Rabot and the Council brought it in just a few moments ago. I've examined it to make sure it meets with Coalition standards for the use of biological weapons. And does it? Evie asked. I'm afraid not. It appears to be a trans-dimensional weapon. Cass swore under his breath. He'd hoped Zax might not betray them to Evie, but now it was all over. There was nothing more he could do. Commander? Is this true? It sounded like she was scolding a child. Core, he hated that tone of voice. No, it isn't, he spat, because as of 20 minutes ago, I resigned my commission. Commander Rabot had nothing to do with this. Mr. Rabot did. Semantics, Evie replied, her face unreadable. He couldn't believe it. Had she already reported this to Green and was just humoring him? Or was she hoping to further humiliate him in some way? And he'd thought they were getting better. If you use that, you'd be court-martialed before we left Coalition space, Evie said. Don't you see? I was trying to do this so you and the captain wouldn't have to make the call, so nothing would happen to you. We could have survived, Evie. We could have made it. I know, her eyes flashed. But you'd rather do things by the book, right? Maintaining the integrity of the coalition is more important than all our lives, or all the lives we might save learning more about Andromeda. Does none of that matter?" "Caspian," Zenford said, causing him to turn, "you are missing the point. Commander Diazal agrees with you. Look at her." Cass turned back to Evie, his head flinching. What was Zenford seeing that he couldn't? Everything about her appearance suggested confrontation. The stern look, the weapon. And yet her body wasn't tensed up, like one would be when walking into a room ready for a fight. Was it all for show? "Is that true? You agree with me?" Her face softened. "I can't let the ship go down when we have a chance to save it. The captain may not be willing to go against the regulations, but I'm not willing to stand by and do nothing. Launch the missile. Box is at the ready on the bridge to take the helm from Lieutenant Rond. He'll get us out of here in time." "He snitched on me, didn't he?" She grinned. "For a pathological liar, he's not very good." "I'm afraid that's my fault," Zach said. "I've been encouraging him to speak the truth more often. It's imperative when in medical situations. I'm afraid he's out of practice." "Doctor," Evie said, "I know I can't ask you to be a party to this, but—" "A party to what?" "I certified that missile ready for launch." She pointed toward the storage area. "What was done after I left, I have no knowledge of." Her small mouth formed a grin, and she walked out of the room, the doors closing back behind her again. "Are you sure about this?" Cass asked. He thought Evie might turn on him again, everything before being nothing but a ruse to get Zax out of the room. But instead, Evie nodded. "Just hurry." 38. "I can't believe it," Cass said. He would have gone to his grave betting Evie would never have broken Coalition regulations like this. But here she was, aiding and abetting in what the Coalition considered a punishable crime. "Believe me, I'm still grappling with it myself," she said. "But we don't have a choice. Green will destroy this ship rather than compromise his values." "Sound like someone you know?" He scoffed. "Trust me, I've already been down that route. Look, you get back up to the bridge. They can't know you had anything to do with this. They'll court-martial you if they find out." "Can you two handle it?" He nodded. "Just keep the technicians out of here, and we'll make sure it's loaded and ready. Green will think this is the biological weapon. When it blows, Box will take the helm and get us out of here before the wave hits us and strands us in the middle of non-navigable space." "You realize what we're doing, right?" Evie asked, closing the panels on the missile. "We're destroying the possibility any civilization from any nearby planet will be able to leave their homeworlds." "I know," Cass said, his eyes down. "There are 2 planets close that are inhabited, both in different systems. I already scanned them. They haven't reached spacefaring technology yet, but one probably will in another 100 years. And when they try to reach out into space," she began, "they'll find themselves stranded. They'll believe all of space is like that, when really it will just be the lack of dimensional grounding that will keep them from obtaining any thrust. Not to mention, all the undercurrents in this area will be obliterated." She gave him a sad smile. "Is it worth it? For our lives?" "Maybe not. But for the future of the Coalition," he replied. "You still do not understand. You still value all life equally," Zenford interjected. "Those lives on the planets below, they are not comparable to yours. Those small people don't have the slightest idea of what awaits them. You do. You know the threats, and you will be protecting them, whether they know it or not. So yes, the lives of the people on the ship are worth more than whole planets full of people. Equity, not equality." "How can you say that?" Evie asked. "Some person down there might have the knowledge to devise a new type of transportation. They might be able to beat the odds." Zenford didn't flinch. "Then let them beat it. But don't judge them for things they haven't done yet. You have built a coalition full of lives you must protect. That is your duty, not adhering to some rule that no longer applies." Cass placed his hand on her arm. "Evie, she's right. It's a hard call, but we have to make it. Get back to the bridge so everyone sees you there. We'll stay here." She groaned, but nodded. I'll do everything I can to keep them from finding out. Don't worry about us. We're already in trouble here. But you're not. You can still make a difference out there. Don't do anything to jeopardize your position. She nodded, then gave one last look at Zenfor before exiting. Give it one more check while I fire up the manual controls, Cass said. He ran over to Ensign Talia's station and disabled the auto-fire function. The comm opened automatically. Weapons? This is the bridge. How is that missile coming? We're running short on time up here. Cass gritted his teeth and tried to pitch his voice high, hitting the return button. Almost ready. 5 minutes. Zenfor stared at him as if he was crazy. Talia? Is that you? Green said. We're getting some interference, Cass said, shrugging at Zenfor. Stand by. He muted the comm. That's not going to hold, he said. How long do you think? Long enough for Commander Diazol to get back to the bridge? I have no clue, but no matter what, we can't let them get in here, not until it's launched. Zenfor nodded, finishing her inspection. Everything here is... The door slid open to reveal Ensign Talia, a confused look on her face. What's going on? The captain just called me. Did you impersonate... In less than 2 seconds, Zenfor had crossed the room and snatched Talia by the collar, dragging her into the room while the door slid closed behind her. What did you tell him? She asked in a less than friendly voice. Tell who? She coughed. Zenfor? Set her down. She can't breathe. Zenfor lowered her to the ground, but didn't release her collar. I apologize, Zenfor said in the same threatening tone. What did you say to the captain? I told him you were in here with the commander, and that Commander Diazol had dismissed me. Shit, Cass yelled, running back over to weapons control. We don't have a choice. We'll need to launch it now. Bring her over here. Easy, Talia said. Cass could now see the tattoo clearly on the side of her head. It was an intricate design crafted around a symbol Cass recognized. His stomach plummeted once he realized what it was. The symbol might have been augmented, so it was difficult to discern, but Cass could still see the original outline of the Sargan Trade Commission. Talia had been sold by the Sargans once upon a time. Counsel, let her go, Cass said. Talia wrenched herself away from the much taller woman. What planet are you from, Paxi? Her face turned into a scowl. Sinoja. You recognized it. Of course you would. He wanted to question her about it. Why hadn't she had the tattoo removed? Or grown her hair over it? Why keep it on display for everyone to see? Not that many of the Coalition would probably recognize it. But at the moment, they didn't have the time. Evie was possibly in danger of being discovered. I need you to call up to the bridge. Tell them we'll be ready in 5 minutes. And you have to tell them Commander Diazol wasn't here. The scowl was replaced by confusion. Why would I do that? Because it's the right thing to do. And you know all about people being hurt for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She stared at the missile. This isn't a biological weapon, is it? The less you know, the better. Better than dying, I guess. She sighed and tapped the comlink. Bridge, this is weapons control. Commander Rabeau reports ready to fire in 5 minutes. And I apologize. I meant to say Commander Rabeau dismissed me earlier. Acknowledged, weapons control, Lieutenant Uma said. Happy? Talia crossed her arms. It'll do. Now what do we need to make sure this missile fires? Cass asked. It will need new command codes, Talia said. Each time a firing pattern is changed, new codes are required. Since you removed the old missile, I'll need new authorization. Cass glanced back at Zenfor. Guess you were right. These will be good for one more time. He entered his personal code into the console, authorizing the change. That's all we need, Talia said. Should I evacuate the room or something? Cass shook his head, pointed to Zenfor. Stay here. Make sure the missile doesn't malfunction. Where are you going? She asked. The bridge. I need to make sure this happens the way we want it to happen. Evie walked back onto the bridge, just as Uma ended a comm with someone, but she hadn't heard who. The lieutenant briefly glanced her way, then returned to her duties. She couldn't help but wonder if her cover was already blown. Maybe it would be better if she didn't try to hide what she knew. But that would mean she was party to a coup. She glanced at Boggs, who stood off to the side of the bridge, watching the action on the screen before them. In the center of the darkness, a pinpoint of light had appeared, though Evie couldn't tell where it was coming from. But it looked like a nearby star. "Would someone like to tell me what the hell it's doing?" Green asked. "Unknown, sir," Zal said. "None of our readings have changed." "Is it coming from the creature?" Evie took her seat, hoping her absence wasn't noticed by anyone other than Uma. "Again, unknown." "Engine status," Green said. "Down to 14%, Ensign Tyler reported over the comm. Evie glanced at the bridge engineering station. Without Blum there, they had to communicate directly with engineering, which is only one more thing on Ensign Tyler's plate. "We can't hold much longer, sir, and our distance is still slipping. It's slowly pulling us in." "Don't worry, Ensign," Green said. "We have one more run to try." He turned to Zal. "Is the data probe ready?" Zal nodded, his hood bobbing back and forth. "I want it launched as soon as we confirm the weapon didn't work. We can only pray someone out there will find it and avoid this area in the future." If there's anyone left in the future, Evie thought. She caught the sound of the hypervator doors opening and glanced over her shoulder to see Cass walk out. "Sir? Permission to take Commander Blum's station," Cass said. "Please, we need all the help we can get." He still hadn't taken his eyes off the screen in front of them. Without missing a beat, he continued. "Were you able to find the console?" "Yes, sir. She's fine. Nothing to worry about." Cass shot looks to Evie and to Boggs. Could they really do this? And what would be the repercussions? She didn't think she could sit back and play innocent when she knew exactly what was going to happen. That was cowardly. And if there was one thing Evie Diazol was not, it was afraid. "Captain," she said, turning to him, "you need to know something." Boggs had moved away from the wall, and Cass shook his head slightly, his eyes pleading not to give herself away. But if they were going to do this, the captain deserved to know, rather than have the rug pulled out from under him. He needed to be aware she was a willing participant, because her actions would have consequences. "Yes, Commander?" His gaze still hadn't left the screen. "Against your orders, sir, we have replaced the biological weapon with a transdimensional one." Cass rose from the engineering station, keeping his movements measured. If the captain did something rash, Cass might have to take over tactical, which would mean going toe-to-toe against Uma, who was rumored to be a superb fighter. Green's eyes softened. "Yes, Commander, I know." Evie took stock of the rest of the bridge. Everyone had turned to watch the confrontation, and Boggs had inched closer to Lieutenant Rond, dead set on taking his position to move the ship. Cass's eyes were as wide as Evie's felt, as her heart thrummed in her chest. "Lieutenant Uma, prepare to fire," Green said, his brows forming a deep V. He knew, and he was doing it anyway. Evie glanced at Cass, whose face was a mixture of concern and confusion. "Mr. Boggs, would you be so kind as to take the helm from the ensign? No offense, Mr. Rond, but as I understand it, this might get rough." Rond glanced at Boggs, then at the captain, and stood, making room for the robot to take his place. "Thanks," Boggs said, as he exchanged a glance. "Sir? You knew?" Evie asked. He leaned over to her. "I suspected when I spoke with Ensign Talia. The real Ensign Talia." He shot Cass a glance. "Commander, please take your post. This will strain our engines, and I need to make sure they don't blow out on us." Cass looked as though he was about to say something, but instead did as he was told and manned the bridge engineering station. Green turned back to her. "As wrong as it is, in this case, it's the right call. And I didn't realize that until it was almost too late. I was prepared to send the lieutenant down there to arrest him until I realized the absurdity of it all. I was following a set of rules laid out by the Coalition that weren't designed to take into account extreme situations such as this. We have to be willing to adapt with the times. Tempest must be allowed to complete her mission." At first she thought she'd gone mad. Cordell Green, respected captain of the Coalition, using a trans-dimensional weapon in an area of space where it would cut off not one, but 2 entire civilizations from the rest of the galaxy? It made sense for a renegade like Cass, and someone with a different moral code like Zenfor, but the captain? Wasn't his reasoning the same as hers? Hadn't they all come to the same eventual conclusion? The Coalition wasn't always right. It wasn't doctrine. Cass knew that better than any of them. And so, it seemed, did the captain. What about the consequences? He turned back to the screen. "We'll deal with those when we reach them. I don't make this decision lightly, Commander, but it's the right call. May the universe forgive us." He turned his attention to Lieutenant Uma. "Fire." 39. A bright red comet streaked across the screen in front of them, locked on the pinpoint of light. Cass watched it grow closer and closer, still unable to believe what had just happened. Green had come through for them after all. He'd been wrong. The man wasn't Rutledge at all. He only wished this endeavor hadn't cost them 3 good crew members. Silently, he said his goodbye to Susanna as he watched. "Mr. Box, can you rotate us around? We need to be in optimal position," Green said. "Working on it. The controls are not up to my standards," he replied. "Ensign? Is our course out of this area of space plotted?" he asked River. "Aye. We'll have to skirt the edge of the nebula. Based on projections, the affected area will be approximately 8 light-years in circumference. We'll need to fly at full speed for 15 hours to escape it." "Rabot?" Cass glanced at his screens. They still had full engine power, and everything looked good from engineering, as long as it all held. The engines had been under strain for a couple days now. He hoped when the creature released them, everything didn't snap back with additional force. It could damage or even destroy the undercurrent drive. "We're as good as we'll ever be," he replied. They all watched the red comet shrink into the distance until it was no longer visible. "Lieutenant?" Green asked. "Still on course, sir, but it's passed out of our visual range. Whatever that—" There was a bright red flash on the screen, and the ship shook, nearly throwing Cass from his seat. "The field has dropped," Bach said. "Engaging undercurrent drive." Everything on Cass's screen jumped to the red. He hit his comm. "Zenfor? Are you still in weapons?" "Yes, with Talia," she said. "Get to engineering. They're going to need your help." Every system was showing overloads, as the pull they'd been exerting had suddenly released. It was what he'd been afraid of. It was like that old game of tug-of-war. When one side finally won, everyone on the winning side fell over each other, still pulling. The engines were experiencing something similar. "Very well," came her reply. She was probably apprehensive about working with Tyler, but this was no time for bickering. "Commander?" Green asked. "Working on it," he said, doing his best to keep the levels even. If he could help them regulate things from up here, it would take some of the pressure off, and they could focus on the actual equipment down there. "We're slowing," Bach said. "Undercurrent drive is only at 80%. "It won't be enough," River added. "Space is already starting to destabilize behind us." Cass chanced to look at the screen, seeing nothing but a field of red closing in on them. Frantic, he returned to his monitors, but there was only so much he could do from up here. "I've arrived," Zenfor said. "Talk to Sester. Get the engines back up to 90. We won't clear the field otherwise," he said. There was no response on the other end. "Consul? Did you catch that?" He glanced at Evie and the captain. "Consul?" Zenfor had entered into a flurry of activity. Humans ran around, yelling things at each other, while Sester, in his cradle at the back of engineering, used all of his appendages to work different systems. A cursory evaluation of the situation determined the undercurrent emitters were losing power, and the ship would either be thrown from the tunnel or crushed by it before it could escape the shockwave generated by the missile. They needed to reset the emitters while they were still moving. "Your grasp of our technology is impressive." The voice in her head startled her for a moment, before she remembered the Claxians were telepaths. She stared at the commander, the only person on the ship she feared disappointing. He was one of the reasons she'd agreed to come on this journey. The Sill knew little to nothing about Claxians, due to their reclusive nature, and the fact many didn't leave their homeworld. "Thank you," she replied. "Do you wish for me to assist?" "I fear what will happen if you do not." Zenfor broke into a trot over to the master display system in the middle of the room. Ensign Tyler was already there, his face covered with perspiration and his features pulled tight. He didn't think they would make it. "Ensign," she said, commanding his attention. He stared at her as if he didn't recognize her. "We need to reset your undercurrent emitters while we are still moving. You will reset them one at a time while I rotate your containment field at a fast enough rate of speed that the undercurrent won't collapse." "What?" he asked, a dazed look in his eyes. "Oh, Sester says the field isn't strong enough to—" he rubbed his head, "to handle that kind of force." "I will make it stronger," she replied, accessing the field geometry. "Hey, how do you know how to do that?" He crossed over to her. "I've been studying you for weeks. Your interfaces are primitive and easy to understand." She began warping the field geometry, using equations often used on Sill ships. Here she was again, sharing more of her people's technology with this inferior culture. Yet she had no choice. "I've never seen geometry like that before. It's enough to work." "He says—" "I heard him," Zenfor replied, finishing the equations. "Now shut down emitter 1 and reset. The field should hold." Tyler nodded, making his way back over to his original station. "Shutting down 1. Magnus, Sophie, keep an eye on the outputs. We can't drop below 80%. 1 has been reset. Move to 2, Zenfor said. She adjusted the equations to compensate for the fact emitter 1 was now at full capacity. The undercurrent was holding. "Impressive. Your manipulation of the undercurrent is unlike any I've seen before. Thank you. That's a compliment coming from a Claxian." Zenfor was fully aware the Claxians were the primary reason most of the other species in the Coalition were spaceborne. Their advanced technology, while not as advanced as the Sill, had given them the edge above many other species. However, unlike the Sill, the Claxians had decided to share it with their neighbors. 2 is reset. Moving to 3, Tyler said. "Output is at 84%, the human named Magnus yelled. Zenfor glanced at him. He was the same one who had ridiculed her at the goodbye ceremony. But instead of an urge to rip his head from his shoulders, she only felt sorry for him. That he couldn't understand the deep meaning of the ceremony itself. Some humans got it, such as Caspian. Others, such as Magnus, never would. 3 is reset. Last 1, Tyler said. He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "I think this is actually going to work." This coalition hadn't been what she'd expected. Seeing these different species working together, Claxian, human, Dorsai, Untaburo, it stirred something inside her. None of these species could have accomplished what they had on their own. It was only by pooling themselves together that they had survived. And hadn't that been what she'd tried to tell Caspian earlier? That they needed to adapt to survive? She thought back to her own people, subjugating the other space-capable races inside Sill space, just because they hadn't reached the same level of technological advancement as the Sill. And she was reminded of Zakria, who died because she didn't fit. Zenfor made a decision. "Ensign, please realign the undercurrent emitters to these specifications I'm sending you," she said, programming a new set of calculations into the computer. "But all the emitters are reset. We're almost back to full power," he said. "Trust me," she replied. "Consul, what is your plan?" "To pool our resources. Ready, Ensign?" He nodded. "Everything is in, but I don't see what—" She tapped the initiative controls, and the ship lurched forward. Sester's voice returned to her head. "I see. This is very clever. And after it is all over, I wish to discuss the implications with you further." "I would like that as well," she thought. "Engineering, what's happening?" Cass's voice yelled over the comm. Engineering, respond! Zenfor could feel herself being pulled against the artificial gravity in the room. She'd forgotten to use the ship's dampeners to compensate. She quickly made an adjustment, and the pull on them eased. Tyler let go of the Master Systems display, his knuckles white. Engineering! We're shutting down. We can't... She reached over and tapped the comm. Hold your course. Mr. Box, don't stop flying. Commander Sester and I have an understanding. Ensign? This time it was Captain Green. Is this true? Tyler stared at her a moment. Yes, sir. She and the commander know what they're doing. Acknowledged, Green's voice said. Tyler's eyes were wide with amazement as he watched the data on his screens. How did you do this? He asked. If there is one thing my people know, it is how to travel long distances. She smiled at him, something she'd never thought she'd find herself doing with the one human who had antagonized her more than any other. Think of it as my contribution to the mission. Tyler smiled back. Thank you. 40. So you mean to tell me we're on the other side of the XL Nebula? Green said. He sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by Cass, Evie, Ensign Tyler, Lieutenant Zoll, and Zenfor, who was the only one who hadn't taken a seat. Yes, sir. We've traveled over 10 light-years in less than an hour, far beyond the distance we needed to avoid the effects of the transdimensional weapon, Tyler reported. And exactly how was this possible? He asked, leaning in. By opening micro-wormholes in rapid succession along our flight path using Tempest undercurrent emitters. We stayed within the undercurrent. I just made it a lot faster, Zenfor replied. To say Cass was astounded would be putting it mildly. Zenfor had found a way not only to get them far beyond the blast radius, but on the other side of the nebula. It normally would have taken them days to get through it, and they'd managed it in a fraction of the time. Not only that, but she'd finally managed to work with some of the rest of the crew. When he'd questioned her about it after they'd come to the bridge, all she had said was she saw a problem needing solving, and so she solved it. Does this mean we can use the technology again? Green asked. Can we make more jumps? Zenfor nodded. We'll be able to reach your destination much quicker, but it will have to be in bursts. Your emitters can't handle sustained accelerations. Why didn't you do this before now? He asked. I was following my own codex. I was only to help you improve your own technology, not impose my own on yours. But the situation required adaptation. There could be far-reaching consequences for my actions. I believe we're all in that boat, Green replied. How much time does that cut off our trip? Practically all of it. We can be at Omicron Terminus in 9 days, Tyler said, his eyes alight with excitement. Which includes breaks to cool the emitters, Zenfor added. Yes, sorry. By using this, we'll have to shut down periodically to allow the emitters to reset. Tyler nodded to Zenfor appreciatively. Cass couldn't believe what he was seeing. Green sat back in his chair. And Sester, what does he think of all this? He wants to examine the technology further, Tyler said. Spend a few days understanding the basic science behind it before we fully implement it. A sensible precaution. Green glanced at Evie. Now that we're ahead of schedule, I think we'll be making a stop at Hypaxia in a few days. Or is it only hours now? Let's take some time to regroup when we get there. Cass noticed Evie's shoulders relax. What was on Hypaxia? Sure, it was on their route, but it wasn't a particularly important coalition world, though they would have orbital facilities for the ship if necessary. And status of the creature? No further signals, and no sign of the creature itself or the tear in space, Zenfor reported. My scans were clear after the missile did its job. Then let's hope that's the end of it, and the loss of our crew will be the last that have to suffer at its hands. Commander, he said, turning to Evie, please prepare funeral services. I want to honor each of our friends in turn. Yes, sir. She snuck a quick glance at Cass. Their eyes met, and hers fell away before he had a chance to register her facial expression. Green addressed Tyler. "Ensign, you're dismissed." He nodded, rising and giving another appreciative look to Zenfor before exiting. "Now, it seems I have to make an uncomfortable call to the Admiral. Coalition sensors will no doubt have picked up the use of the weapon by now. There might be an escort waiting for us when we get to Hypaxia." Cass turned to him. "Sir? You need to blame me." Green arched an eyebrow. "I appreciate your sacrifice, Commander, but—" "No, sir. You don't understand. I resigned my commission before I helped Zenfor prepare and launch the missile. I was acting as a Coalition citizen and nothing more." Green exchanged glances with Evie. "Look, the only way this works, and the two of you aren't court-martialed, is if you blame it on me. It makes sense. I betrayed you again. You had no knowledge of the missile. No one did, except for me and Zenfor. I think Ensign Talia down in weapons will work with us." "Commander, you do realize, as captain, I am responsible for all those under my command, no matter the choices they make?" "With all due respect, sir, I wasn't under your command, and I'm not right now. The Coalition and we just don't fit anymore. My mistake was in thinking we did." Saul spoke up. "His sacrifice would exonerate you and the commander from any wrongdoing." "But what happens to Cass? And the Consul?" Evie asked. "We can't just turn them over to the authorities." "I doubt Coalition Central will do anything to the Council. The bonds there are too fragile. They won't want to risk what little progress we've made so far. As for the Mr. Rabot, I don't know. A second offense, and one of this magnitude, will not be easy. I expect they'll pull him off at Hypaxia or Starbase 5 and hold a trial, despite the fact he may have been resigned at the time. Even as a citizen, there would be extreme consequences." Cass took a deep breath. Back to jail. Somehow he'd always known it was in the cards. Hopefully this time they wouldn't try to kill him. "That's fine. Talia will say I tricked her. Zax can back it up, and neither of you have any knowledge of what I did until afterward." Green worked his jaw. "I want to impress upon you how serious this is. By admitting to this, you'll be admitting you didn't just break a law, you broke a regulation. The punishment may be more severe. At least, if you were acting under my command," Cass shook his head, "the entire reason I was willing to use the missile in the first place was because this mission needs to succeed. And it can't do that if its captain and first officer are arrested for environmental terrorism. I'm more than familiar with the punishments." Green sighed. "Very well. If that—" "No," Evie yelled. "This is not acceptable. There has to be another option." "It's a trans-dimensional weapon. I don't think they make exceptions," Cass said, leaning back in the chair. One thing was for sure. He was going to get drop-dead drunk before they came for him. It might be the last time he ever could. "They can't arrest him," Zenfor said from her corner. Cass turned to her. "Didn't you read the Coalition's organizing principles and their amendments?" "Yes, but it doesn't matter. If they arrest you, I will declare any and all possibility of an alliance null and void." Cass stood. "I can't ask you to do that. What if they call your bluff?" "Who says it's a bluff? You are the liaison to the SIL. Removing you from the equation would be a betrayal to us, telling us the Coalition is not serious about forming a long-term relationship. Not to mention, I was the one who modified the missile. It was SIL technology, not Coalition." For a moment, Cass didn't know how to express his gratitude toward her. She was putting a lot of faith in him. Why? She had never been much more than neutral toward him, and all members of the Coalition for that matter. But for some reason, she was willing to risk herself for him, to risk the SIL future for him. Cass turned to Green. "There's no way they'll let this go. It's too big." I guess there's only one way to find out, the captain said, standing. I'll make my report to Admiral Sangvi and let you know what he says. Honestly, it could go either way. It depends on what the Coalition decides is the bigger threat, Andromeda or you. He made to exit, with Zal following close behind. But before he was beyond the doors, he turned back. Regardless of what happens, thank you for your willingness to fall on your sword for us, for this mission, and for the Coalition. The doors closed behind him and Zal. Evie stared across the table at him, her eyes sad. Could you give us a few minutes? Cass asked Zenfor. She nodded and left the room. So, she replied. What's on Sypaxia? She flinched. My dying father. She glanced down at his open uniform. One sleeve had torn, somewhere between the weapons lab and the conference room. Did you really resign? Yep, you were right. The uniform was too tight after all, he said, staring at the tear in the arm. Turns out I can be more help when I'm not an officer. How? By throwing yourself to the wolves? Her face was unreadable. If that's what it takes. I don't think I'll ever understand you. That's because you've missed the last 30 lunches. Don't you know? I'm incorrigible. He smirked, and she fought to smile back. Plus, if I'm going to jail, I want to make my last few meals enjoyable, and that's only possible with good company. Join me? She stood, the smile reaching her eyes. I'd be glad to. This has been Darkest Reach, Infinity's End, Book 3, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. Copyright 2019 by Eric Warren. Production copyright 2020 by Eric Warren.